On the 27th of January 1945, 69 years ago, the Russian army liberated a place called Auschwitz. That name has since become a symbol for the abject depravity to which humans can sink. And it was chosen as the official Remembrance Day. The Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer was invited to address the German parliament, and with superb lucidity and complete absence of bitterness or animosity, he outlined the uniqueness of the Holocaust. He said then that one would think that the interest in this specific genocide would slowly subside, but that the contrary seems to be the case, and one has to ask why. Why do we talk about the Holocaust so much and not about the Cambodia or the Tutsis or the Bosnians, to name but a few genocides committed in the last century? One cannot possibly make a comparative study of genocides. It is the precedenceless of the Holocaust that is beginning to be understood now everywhere in the world. A very special genocide has taken place here. It was a decision made in a civilized country, Germany, to track down, register, mark out, isolate from their surroundings, dispossess, humiliate, and murder every single person of an ethnic group for purely ideological reasons, Jews. The common denominator of genocides is simply the senseless murder of human beings. On his departure from Yugoslavia, a British journalist said that he will never forget seeing columns of people leaving their homes, dressed in their Sunday best with layers of warm clothes, and in their pockets family photographs, because they could only take what they could carry on their flight to a piece of earth that was designated for them by this senseless ethnic cleansing. Now this rings a bell. We were seen in columns, but there was no designated piece of earth for us. We were surplus to requirement. The things we carried were taken from us on arrival, wherever that may be. There was no international outcry, no United Nations. For the first time in history, all people who descended from 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents were sentenced to death because they had been born. And everywhere of Jewish origin had to be reached wherever Nazi Germany had influence, and it had quite a lot of influence. Usually genocides happen in specific, although sometimes very extended areas. The genocide of the Jews was envisaged universal, worldwide. Of course, in time, it'll just be a chapter in history books. Nobody will be around to testify that it actually took place. What happened in Germany was the direct result of mindless propaganda and brainwashing. The general situation between the 2 world wars was, of course, very bad. Unemployment, a ludicrous inflation, dissatisfied people, and if you need scapegoats for your misfortunes, there is nothing easier and more convenient than targeting Jews. If you saw the newspapers or even children's books or games from these days, you would find it hard to believe to what depth people can sink. Jews were pictured as monsters and vermin that simply had to be exterminated. And this madness eventually culminated in the most sophisticated mass murder in history. In Germany, there was silence after the war. In fact, there was silence everywhere. The misdeeds were incomprehensible. We read that 6 million people have been murdered. How can one expect that simple figures, especially 7-digit ones, can possibly convey to the post-war generation what the word Holocaust meant in reality? What happened to completely normal families? What it meant to be persona non grata because you were a Jew or a gypsy or any other sort of subhuman. By some fluke, and I assure you it was some fluke, I'm still alive, and I know that in order to come a little closer to grasping what life was like in those days on a day-to-day basis, it is easier to identify with a living person. I'll give you a brief synopsis of my life and how I came to have so many different labels attached to my person. I started life as an ordinary child, then I became a dirty Jew, then I graduated to undesirable and vermin that simply had to be destroyed. And eventually, when I was liberated by the British Army on the 15th of April 1945, I changed my status to displaced person. Today, I am a survivor. Since no one ever asked me what actually happened to me between the outbreak of the war and my arrival at Victoria Station in March 1946, I settled for a life in limbo, so to speak, isolated from normal people. I was born in Breslau, which was German then, it is Polish now and called Wrocław. My father was a lawyer, my mother was a beautiful lady, and incidentally, a very fine violinist. I think there are some pictures there. These are my parents. We had a very happy home. There was no particular emphasis on being Jewish. We were three sisters. We all learned to play an instrument, and I played the cello. My father had a great love for languages, and he maintained that people have as many souls as they have languages. We were brought up speaking French. In fact, there was a rule in our house that on Sundays, French only had to be spoken. In my youthful ignorance, I thought that this was absolutely stupid. And I never opened my mouth on Sundays. But I can speak French. Life was normal and good, and then I had my first experience with anti-Semitism. I was about 8 years old, but I remember it. I was about to wipe the blackboard in the small school that I attended when a pupil, snatched the sponge from me and said, "Don't let the Jews have the sponge." Or people would spit at me in the street, call me a dirty Jew. I couldn't really understand what the hell was going on here. One just had to accept that one was different. Public places started to display signs that Jews were not welcome, schools closed, we were not allowed to own radios, bicycles had to be surrendered, and back to the Middle Ages. We had to wear the yellow star on our clothes. One tried to go somewhere safe, somewhere where one was not going to be killed. But as night follows day, it became more and more difficult to find a safe haven, frontiers closed, and the difficulties one had to overcome to obtain entry into another country became well nigh ludicrous. Enormous difficulties were made by the Germans themselves, who were so keen to get rid of us. If you wanted to get away, you had to pay. Many people did not get away, and I assure you it was not for lack of trying. My family was among those. Now, on the 20th of January 1942, a conference took place in a suburb of Berlin called Wannsee. And at this Wannsee conference, it was discussed, and it took just 1 hour and a half, how to exterminate European Jewry. And we are talking here of a matter of 11 million people. On the 9th of April 1942, my parents were deported and sent on a transport to the east, as it was called, to a place called Ispica near Lublin. I never saw them again. I was 16 years old. 2 months later, after the liberation, I wrote a letter to my sister Marianne in London, telling her about the last hours of our parents. And this letter was, of course, written in German. This is a translation, and I'll just read a few sentences. I would like to tell you a little about the departure of our parents. We knew a day before that it was going to catch up with them now. Mum cried a great deal. She must have felt instinctively that the end was now coming. Our names were not on the list, but if we had simply presented ourselves, we would hardly have been sent back. But Dad did not want to hear of it. It is better that you remain where we are going. One gets there soon enough. We did not exchange many words. There was a lot to do. Packing, packing. We didn't know then that everything was going to be taken off them anyway. Dad did nothing else but conclude his, or rather other people's affairs, so he worked, typed, and dictated late into the night. He said that I should wait for him. So I took a notebook and a pencil in my hand and waited with Mum next door. She cried and cried. She was so frightened. We had 3 letters before the news stopped. There was nothing factual in these letters, nothing about the circumstances, only at the very end, send food. And in his last letter, there was just a psalm. I lift up mine eyes to the hills from whence cometh my help. I often thought of this when things were really bad for me. I'll go back now again. I waited for Dad, and at 2 a.m. he finally called me. He had aged by 20 years that night. He dictated everything I had to do into my book, how to pay the rent, how to pay the gas bill, and to whom I had to write, and he gave me power of attorney to sign his name if ever a signature should be required. I count on you, Anita. You know, he didn't easily count on anybody. By the way, I think I coped well with all the technicalities. I did have a lot of trouble with the Inland Revenue, who pursued us relentlessly right into prison. But all is now over and done with. I am aware of the fact that on the night of April 8th to April 9th, I took on responsibility not only for the rent and gas, but for something much bigger. That night was very decisive for me. Yes, we should not cease to be thankful to our parents and live as though they could always see us. After the war, I went to the Wiener Library, a documentation center in London dealing with the persecution of Jews. There I learned that the method of murdering where my parents went was that the victims had to dig their own graves, undress, and be shot into these graves. A very messy way of eliminating human beings. Better, faster, cleaner ways had to be found, and as you know, they were found. Gas chambers. The murderers no longer had to soil their own hands. Special commandos were made to do the dirty work for them. And they had to herd their own people into the gas chambers. Now my parents had gone, my grandmother had gone, and we had to go to an orphanage. Some time before that, we had been conscripted to work in a paper factory where the workforce consisted of Jews, Poles, and French prisoners of war. My job was to stick labels round toilet rolls, and I became extremely adept at this. I would never accept that I should be killed for what I happened to be born as. I decided that it was more dignified to give my enemies a better reason for killing me. I involved myself in clandestine activities, forged papers for French prisoners of war to escape with, and eventually tried to escape myself. These papers were leave passes for French civilian workers who, unlike French POWs, were allowed to go on leave from time to time. It was, of course, strictly forbidden to talk to the prisoners. We chose to ignore this and developed an extremely ingenious way of communicating with them. There were segregated toilets in the factory, and in the toilet for Jews, the bracket holding the chain for flushing had broken loose, and you could pull it straight out of the wall, leaving a hole. And on the other side of the wall was the refectory of the French prisoners. We developed a sort of sign language whereby a prisoner and I would go to our respective locations. I would remove the bracket and we communicated through this hole, a bit like Midsummer Night's Dream, by whispering almost inaudibly into each other's ears, or we passed messages through. My job was to produce civilian clothes, forged the writing on the papers that were given to me, because I was able to write the old-fashioned German script, and I still had a typewriter. One day, I found that the hole had been blocked up. I had obviously been observed, but by that time we had managed to get a great many prisoners out. Now the moment had come, we decided to make a run for it ourselves and try to get somehow into the unoccupied zone of France. It is interesting when I speak at German schools, they have no idea what the unoccupied zone of France was. So we tried to escape there with these forged papers. It wasn't exactly the most thought out escape plan, but one didn't think too far ahead in those days. There was one overpowering thought in one's mind: get out of Germany. We didn't get very far, to be exact, no further than the railway station. We had obviously been observed by the Gestapo for some time. We were arrested and sent to prison. We had committed a criminal offense: forgery, helping the enemy, and attempted escape were our indictments when we were eventually appeared in court to be sentenced. Now, the absurdity of my situation was that having committed a criminal offense on top of being a Jew, which was bad enough, actually helped me rather than hindered me. It permitted me to stay in prison for over a year, postponing my arrival at the concentration camp. And when I was eventually sent to Auschwitz, I did not have to go through the usual selection on arrival at the notorious ramp, where the SS chose who should live and who should die. I had a criminal record, a prisoner with a file, and they did not get gassed automatically. In other words, it was preferable to arrive in Auschwitz as a convicted criminal rather than an innocent citizen. But I wasn't there yet. I was still in prison, and prisons are not exactly luxury hotels, I assure you. In fact, it was a pretty ghastly experience. We were 4 people in a cell, which was meant for 1 person. We were always hungry. We were allowed out for half an hour a day to walk around in circles, hands on our backs, in complete silence. There were no outings to washrooms or toilets in prisons in those days. There was a bucket in a corner. It did have a lid. I shall leave it to your imagination what the atmosphere was like in such a cell. However, when I eventually arrived in Auschwitz, I often thought back of my days in prison like of a luxurious holiday. After nearly 1 year in prison, we eventually had our trial at the Sondergericht, a very special court. I'll show you it was special. This was a complete farce. We had no legal representation, nor would we really have wanted one. Our crimes were plain to see, and we thought naively, the longer the sentence, the better, so that we could stay in the relative safety of a prison. But this wasn't so, however. My sister Renate was sentenced to 3.5 years penitentiary, and I was to remain in prison for that time. We returned to our cell, knowing that we would soon be separated, a very daunting prospect, to face what was looming ahead all by yourself. My sister was duly called a few days after the trial and sent to the penitentiary, and I was alone. Although it was strictly forbidden to have any conversation with anybody in prison, one always finds a way around that somehow. We heard rumors about gas chambers. Found it very hard to believe at first. But these rumors were too persistent to be totally ignored. There must be something in it. And it became imperative to acquaint yourself with the diabolical prospect of what was waiting for you when you arrived in Auschwitz. Another rumor was that because of overcrowding in the prisons, Jews were unlikely to finish their sentences in this relative safety, but were sent to Auschwitz. And this is exactly what happened. I was given back my civilian clothes, put on a prison train, and sent eastwards, direction Auschwitz. I arrived in Auschwitz Birkenau in the evening. Now, Birkenau was an addition to the main camp of Auschwitz, some 3 kilometers away, and it was there that the gas chambers were situated. It was beginning of December, freezing cold and pitch black. I was together with a number of other prisoners, all of us with the same advantage of having a criminal conviction. We waited all night in a barrack and had ample opportunity to acquaint ourselves with the noises of this infamous place. Dogs barking, people screaming, and a nauseating smell, not very encouraging. Next morning, we had to parade past the people whose job it was to take your clothes off you, shave your hair, and tattoo a number on your arm. My number is 69388. This procedure had the immediate effect of turning normal-looking people into a sort of prototype, stripped of all human dignity. All this was done by prisoners, and they bombarded us with questions. Where had I come from? My name? What news about the war, etc. But somehow it seemed completely absurd under the prevailing circumstances. I told the girl who was processing me that I used to play the cello. Fantastic, she said. Stand aside. You'll be saved. It transpired that there was a band in the camp, and she had gone to get the conductor and tell the conductor that a cellist had arrived. The name of this conductor was Alma Rosé, the daughter of Arnold Rosé, years and years the principal of the opera in Vienna, and the niece of Gustav Mahler. Now, this band, or Kapelle as it was called, had been formed a few months earlier and did not have a cello as yet. Eventually, the conductor arrived, Alma Rosé, and a really ludicrous conversation took place. She asked me where I had come from and with whom I had studied. There I was. That was the very last thing I had expected when arriving in Auschwitz. There I was standing stark naked, talking about cello playing. Alma was absolutely delighted to finally have a cello. She said that I would have to go to the quarantine block, but not to worry, I would soon be transferred to the music block. Now, the quarantine block was for everybody the first, and for a great many people the last port of call. Conditions in this block were indescribable. You slept on a sort of shelf called koje, like sardines, and it was a major problem to be able to get out if you wanted to get to the latrines in time. I reckon that one's time in quarantine was designed to deprive you of the last vestige of dignity. You spent hours and hours on roll call in the freezing cold. You were not allowed to move, and most of us had dysentery by then. I will spare you a description what that meant in real terms. After some time, with what can only be described as living hell, I was escorted to the music block. I was handed a cello and asked to play something. You can imagine I wasn't exactly in top form, but there wasn't too much danger of not passing this so-called audition. Since the orchestra had no bass instrument up to my arrival. It was without any doubt the most unusual combination of instruments one could possibly imagine. It consisted of several violins, guitars, flutes, mandolins, and accordions. Now, finally, there was a cello. Auschwitz was basically run by the prisoners themselves when it came to the daily business of lining up to be counted, or the famous roll call, or distributing food. Now, these prisoners were called kapos. And with very few exceptions, they were brutalized by having been in the camp for a long time and were greatly to be feared by the masses. They had unlimited power to ill-treat people and used this power with great alacrity, but there was one noted exception, a Jewish girl from Belgium by the name of Marla Zimmetbaum. She had a very high position in the camp. She was interpreter for the camp commander and a very special person and greatly respected by all of us. She had a Polish boyfriend, and together they tried to escape. They were caught, brought back to the camp. We had to line up and watch the execution of Mala. She was to be hanged. But she managed to defy her captors by producing a razor blade, which she had hidden somewhere, and she cut her wrists in front of all of us and shouted abuse at her executioners. She was carted away on a sort of wooden cart. I suppose one shot her. We don't know. Just as no one can imagine Auschwitz before Auschwitz, no one can really retell after Auschwitz. Survival seemed impossible. The constant backdrop were the chimneys of the crematoria, the smoke, and the never-ending arrival of transports. In May 1945, the Hungarian transports arrived. The gas chambers and crematoria could no longer cope with the endless stream of condemned human beings. I'm quoting here a short passage from a book by Anita called Calendario of Events in Auschwitz Birkenau. The camp commander Höss ordered the digging of 5 ditches for the burning of corpses. The transports were very large, and it happened that the gas chamber of Crematorium 5 was unable to accommodate everybody. Those who would not fit into the gas chamber were shot. In many cases, people were thrown alive into the burning pits. I survived the murder factory of Auschwitz thanks to the fact that I had the great good fortune to become a member of the Women's Orchestra, and I have no doubt whatsoever that the cello saved my life. I was temporarily of use, and I functioned in a community where we were a small group, and in spite of enormous differences in backgrounds and languages, there reigned a real sense of comradeship and loyalty. Auschwitz and Birkenau were surrounded by factories that employed the prisoners as slave labor, and our task consisted of playing every morning and every evening at the gate of the camp, so that the outgoing and incoming work commanders would march neatly in step to the marches we played. We also had to be available at all times to play to individual SS staff who would come into our block for some light relief after their exhausting work on the ramp, where they sent people to their death. My claim to fame is that I had to play Schumann's Träumerei to Dr. Mengele. I suppose you know who Dr. Mengele was. In other words, as long as our services were required, we were not interchangeable. But I would not be faithful to the truth if I said that we had any illusions as to how we would end up eventually. We were all of us under sentence of death. It didn't seem remotely possible that anybody would come out Auschwitz alive. But a miracle happened. The Russian front advanced, and we were shunted westwards to Bergen-Belsen. No one had ever heard of it. Belsen was very different from Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, people were murdered in the most sophisticated manner. In Belsen, they simply perished. There was no orchestra in Belsen. We sat about and waited and watched each other deteriorate. Belsen was totally ill-equipped to deal with the thousands and thousands of miserable skeletons who arrived there because of the ever-advancing Allied troops. There are no words to describe this inferno. The dead bodies started piling up. There was no food, no water, nothing. We had come to the end of the line. It was also very hot in April, and although it was good not to be freezing all the time, the effect of the temperature on the mountains of corpses was horrendous. Feeble attempts were being made to remove them. Comment not necessary. Those of us who could still walk were given some string. We were to tie the arms of the dead together and drag them along the road to a big ditch. But this operation was soon abandoned as futile. We were too weak, and the bodies remained in the camp. Corpses were so much part of the landscape that we no longer noticed them as anything unusual. We just knew that we were at the end of the road and that it was only a matter of time. We had been without food or without water for days. On April 15th, the camp was deserted by the Germans. We heard a lot of rumbling noise in the distance, and it was suggested this could be the noise of tanks. But whose tanks? We lived in this twilight zone for most of that Sunday. It was about 5 o'clock when the miracle actually happened. The first British tank rolled into the camp. 15th of April 1945. We were liberated. No one who was in Belsen will ever forget that day. We did not greet our liberators with shouts of joy. We were silent. Silent with incredulity and maybe a little suspicion that we might be dreaming. It did not seem possible that this nightmare should have ended. And then came the announcement. There was typhus in the camp. We must remain where we were. Help was on the way. We knew all about the typhus. And where should we have gone anyway? We were so far removed from any form of normality that we could not possibly appreciate the enormity of the problems the British Army encountered. They were simply overwhelming. The first priority was to feed us somehow and to find medical help. And then came the problem of sorting out this mass of humanity. The general idea was a sorting into nationalities with a possible view of repatriation. Many, many hurdles had to be overcome before we could be considered members of the human race again. And we began to address ourselves to the reality of what now? How do we pick up our lives? And even more pressing was the question where? I had miraculously survived, but there couldn't be a question of my going home. What and who would I find there anyway, if indeed I had wanted to go home? So a new phase began. We became a new species, displaced persons. And let's face it, an extremely embarrassing species for everyone. A great deal of patience was needed, but finally, almost a whole year after the liberation, the problem was resolved. For me, I was allowed to come to England, and I was granted a place in society again. Now, the general excuse that one did not know what was happening in Germany and the occupied countries is not valid, as we know. We know now that governments knew very well what was going on, but there were other priorities. Horrendous crimes have been committed by others elsewhere, not just Germans. But the fact that countless people have been murdered at different times does not serve as an excuse for the mass murder we are talking about here. There are no excuses, but most important, there are no comparisons. With all the other genocides we know about, the motives were somehow more realistic, like a fight for power or a fight for territory. Jews had no territory. The Holocaust was based on pure fantasy. The Nazis may not have invented concentration camps, but they gave it a new dimension. But not only the murder and the suffering in these hells should occupy us, but the subtle art of degrading and dehumanizing human beings in order to control them. This did not only happen to Jews, but Jews stood on the lowest rung of the ladder in this hell. What the perpetrators achieved was not the dehumanization of the Jews, but of themselves, by inventing places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, black holes meant for men and women and children only guilty of being Jewish, where you got off the trains in order to enter the gas chambers from which no one ever came out alive. However, the Germans had no difficulty in finding willing helpers among other nationals, like the Ukrainians or Lithuanians. But the streamlined machinery of mass murder was invented by the Germans. No one has put it better than Bernice Rubens in her book, The Brothers. Why was this Holocaust more offensive, more foul, more malignant, more grievous than anything that has happened in history before? It is not a question of numbers. Millions of black people have been slaughtered in their history, millions of Aborigines. Who can count the Armenians? Who dare count the American Indians? No, not numbers. This genocide was different from all others because of its sublime and obscene efficiency. Mass murder where not a minute is lost, mass burial when nothing is wasted, human skin for reading lamps, human flesh for soap, human hair for pillows, men's teeth for investment, no waste, a system meticulous in every detail, long premeditated, planned, and coordinated, and administered with the most sophisticated and satanic technology, a pure artistry of murder. In the whole history of murdering men among all its victimized people, there has never been a more accomplished, a more ingenious or cunning, a terrible cavalcade of cruelty. Let no one ever forget that, ever, ever, ever. Millions of people perished in German concentration camps, and they died in all colors. Red for politicals, yellow for Jews, mauve for Jehovah's Witnesses, green for criminals, black for asocials, brown for gypsies, and pink for homosexuals. Libraries of words have been written about them based on the Nuremberg trials of the accused and on the testimonies of those who have survived. But millions of words were never written. The basic lack of equipment was one reason for the prisoner's silence: a pencil and some paper. There was also the sheer suspicion of one's own terrible words, that one could actually be dwelling in the hell of which one writes. But above all else, the tale is untellable. There exists no pen for such calligraphy, no paper that would not ignite in the terrible fire of each syllable. But in God's sight, if his eyes were open in this place, every syllable of every word was true. Now, when I rejoined the human race after the war, I thought that I had a mission. After all, I was a witness. I had survived to tell the tale. But to my dismay, there was no one who wanted to hear the tale. Maybe what was to know was too horrific to deal with. After all, everyone had suffered during the war and sustained losses. Do we really want to hear about other people's traumata? How much more comfortable could we sleep in our beds if the horror of the Holocaust was just a Jewish invention? No doubt there was a profound sense of shame the world over that such a cataclysmic genocide could have happened not in faraway lands, no, next door, in civilized Europe. The only way to grasp what it actually meant in real terms is to try and identify with a single person, a single family, and multiply it by several million, and put yourself, your family, in that very same situation. And then ask yourself, why? And God forbid, if there should be a next time, could it not be me? I have become a bit more modest in my old age. I no longer think I can change the world. But maybe I can reach some people and persuade them that instead of denigrating and murdering, we respect each other, simply as members of the human race. In the words of the historian Yehuda Bauer, to remember the Holocaust is but a first step. To learn from it and teach it, and everything that happened in the Second World War in the way of racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia is the next responsible step And with that step, we are all dependent on each other. Thank you.